The idea was to look at how children that had been taught in a different way, somehow, this is in a nutshell very much, how they would respond to the idea of producing a sort of new society within their school grounds.
Yes.
Of course, education doesn't only occur within the school, it's also very much part of life and culture and everything outside of it.
Yes.
But the idea was to focus specifically on the sort of methodologies that they had learned in the school, for example, this non-reliance on adults as well, to be able to articulate a discourse by themselves. So when I went to the school and proposed the project, it was actually inserted in the curriculum of the school itself.
Yes.
So it became very much a living part. It didn't feel like a sort of spaceship that had, landed in their normal life. It was something that had been sort of integrated.
Yeah.
Also because they work they're very project-based as an education model. So what we did was simply propose this to the school, and then I worked with the children for 3 weeks, and they were there to sort of produce this new society in their school hall, but they didn't have any other sort of parameters of how they should behave. It was very much up to them. So what we would do occasionally is stop and think about what was happening.
Yes.
So occasionally we would stop, and some scenes you see in the film where the children are sat down and talking amongst themselves.
Debriefing, as it were.
Yes. They are actually discussing what it is that has occurred in some ways. Even the violence that did happen at times was something that they themselves stopped, halted, and talked about. The film Lord of the Flies is present in the work in terms of both the installation that you see when you're actually watching the film and in the workshop itself. As a backdrop is also the backdrop, but it has been used during the workshop. The scene, the sort of scene depicted is actually from the opening scenes of Lord of the Flies, where you see this untamed nature that still needs to be domesticated in some ways. And the premise of the film itself, in some ways, is the idea of a society that does domesticate that particular environment and fails to do so in many ways. I feel there's also this very paternalistic element to the film, though, which I wanted to sort of question. For example, the very last scene of the film where an adult, a Marine I think, or some adult dressed in white comes onto the island to rescue the children who have absolutely failed to create a new world in some ways. And the children throw themselves at this authority's feet. So in some ways it was a questioning of that as a narrative as well. The way this work functions within a wider discourse on my practice is I've always been interested in thinking about sort of public imaginaries and alternative public imaginaries. So in some ways I'm looking at how we could function collectively as a society in different ways that escape sort of neoliberalism in some ways, and looking at the specifics. So education here was a concern. In some ways, through the experiments and through the workshop, the idea is also to question the premise. So effectively, through collaborating with different actors and agents, you break down your own premise in some ways of what an alternative environment would be and how and why it could function, could not function. So I think the element of collaboration is something that I'm interested in pursuing and moving ahead with. And I'm looking at translation and language at the moment as part of this collective process of producing a public imaginary.